Well, if you've been with me through this week, you know that we've been really beginning to look into the first of three letters written by Paul, which we call pastoral epistles or pastoral letters. And they deal with the dynamics of spiritual leadership in the church, which is something that all of us should aspire to in many ways. Not that we all are called to be pastors or elders or something of that nature, but we do have a sphere of influence. We have people's lives that we affect and touch every day, and we should aspire to do it in a way that is fruitful and effective, and pray that God would give us that kind of grace. But we're going to end this week with verse 3. We've gone through verses 1, 2, and 3, where Paul says in 1 Timothy 1:3, "As I urge you upon my departure from Macedonia," Macedonia being northern Greek today. Actually, the country of Macedonia or Macedonia is its own sovereign territory now, right above Greece. He says, "As I urge you on my departure for Macedonia, to remain at Ephesus so that you may instruct certain men not to teach strange doctrines, nor to pay attention to myths and endless genealogies, which give rise to mere speculation rather than furthering the administration of God, which is by faith." Now, the first thing I really want to focus on is Paul's exhortation to remain at Ephesus. And, this is something that's a lot harder to do than most of us realize. We go into a new situation. I think, for example, pastors will take the leadership or the teaching role of a particular church, and it's always exciting in the beginning, and everybody loves you for the first several months. But there comes a time when you begin to find that there's a pushback, there's opposition, there's resistance, and can be some heartbreaking things, some very disappointing things. In some ways, it's not that much different than getting married. I mean, when you get married, you're all excited and you have the thrill of infatuation, but it's just a matter of time before the rose-colored glasses will become clear, the lens will become clear, and no longer are you blinded to certain inadequacies and weaknesses and character flaws in the person that you married. And keep in mind, they are going through the same dynamic as well. And you begin to wonder, what have I done and how do I get out of this? And that's problem is that we give so much validity not only to those feelings and those emotions, but at the same time, we have such a level of low level of commitment, a better way to put it, that we don't really have any stick-to-itiveness. And I've often shared this, but I think about my 99-year-old father-in-law, getting close to be 100, and how he was asked, "How did you stay married for 73 years? And he said, "I just woke up every morning and decided I was going to keep my vows." And, my mother-in-law could be a challenging woman. I wouldn't deny that. But, it would have been easy for him to give up and to move on and say, "I don't need to put up with this anymore." But he chose to stay faithful and true to the end. And I think that's important for us to understand that I found that when I came to Spokane to take the pastor of this church, that there have been some very, very good times and some great successes and seen some tremendous fruitfulness. And there have been some very, very dark and low times in our ministry, and difficult times. And we've gone through all sorts of the different things. The emotional gamut that we flow is pretty broad. And I look back on it so many times and think to myself, I'm just glad that we never gave up. I'm glad that we never threw the towel in, and chose an easier path, because there were times when opportunities would arise that seemed to be easier and more financially beneficial and all that. And I remember just sitting there and saying, "God, what is your will?" In fact, even most recently, I was talking with my board about retirement, and I really had to confess to them that, I think that giving thought to retirement is kind of premature, because I haven't died yet. And so, it's one of those kind of things that if we again are bond slaves of Jesus Christ, those kind of decisions aren't really up to us. As I said before, the slave doesn't set his hours, he doesn't set his wages, he doesn't set his terms of employment or condition of employment. And I know that God called me to be here, and therefore I have to be faithful to what he's given me to do until the day that he calls me to leave, whether that be physically relocating someplace or being simply just, having the lights turned out and going home to be with the Father. Whichever is his choice is I'm good with, because I know it will be best for the kingdom of God, and I know it'll be best for everyone else involved. But he's saying to Timothy, Timothy, you're kind of there, and we see this in his letter to Timothy, that Timothy had a certain weakness of character, that he was kind of a sensitive guy. And I think that's why he really encouraged him so much of the time, because he probably grew up without the strength of a father showing him how to basically get man sweat on him and work his hands and endure. Raised by mothers and his grandmother who loved him dearly, there wasn't maybe that kind of tenacity in him, the kind of tenacity that was clearly in Paul. And Paul said, I just want to exhort you, don't give up when things get difficult. Don't throw in the towel. Don't walk away from what you've been called to do. As long as you know you're where God wants you to be, remain there. Stay there. And for somebody like Timothy, Ephesus was not an easy place. I mean, yeah, the church grew exponentially and great things happened, but so did the opposition. And so it was a greatly conflicted and disruptive place. But what was even more difficult was the disruptions that came not from without, but the destructions that came from within the church itself. He said that there are some who teach strange doctrines. It's interesting. Strange here means something that deviates from the true path. It's something that's contrary to the faith. And so Paul said you have to really instruct certain men not to do that. You need to point out to them where they're in error doctrinally, and don't let them just continue to say what they say. And I find this is really a difficult thing many times, to confront people who are teaching and presenting ideas that aren't really biblically correct. Believe me, they rarely appreciate the correction, and most of them are kind of elevated in their own sense of themselves and feel like they've come to some deep and new revelation. Timothy had to deal with all sorts of theological concepts because the city he was in was one that was just rife with all sorts of crazy religious ideas. It was a religious melting pot, if you will. And he said, you need to not only stay on target and on theme and on message, but you also need to be willing to confront people who are teaching things that are strange, that are deviations from the truth. Now, when Paul wrote to the Galatians, he talked about things that were a falsification of the truth. They would teach another gospel. In other words, they said it was a gospel, but they were teaching something differently. They were teaching a gospel of works, which isn't a gospel at all, Paul wanted to point out. But in this case, he said these are people who are introducing just various things that may not necessarily even apply to people's salvation, but nonetheless, it will lead them to unfruitfulness in their life. Everything from super legalism to, on the other side, the idea of libertinism, that you can do whatever you want. And those conflicts still are part of what the Bible struggles with, the church struggles with, even in the modern era. And secondly, he said, teach them not to pay attention to myths. Myths are basically fictions or fables or basically inventions that are nothing else but the fruit of people's imagination, but they're not true. And I find this hard because sometimes I'll be talking to somebody about something and they'll say, well, I heard this and I saw this and there was this archaeological discovery. And I have to go back and say, actually, that's not accurate. That's not true. The person who is saying that is actually falsifying and telling you something that's nothing else but a fable. I remember one particular individual who had quite a following. And he talked about finding all sorts of archaeological discoveries that he could never validate, you could never find, and people got all excited about it, talking about finding Noah's Ark or chariot wheels in the Red Sea or any number of things. And the bottom line was, later on, after he passed away, his son admitted that he was making this stuff up. So don't be afraid to check things out and see if they're actually true, and especially detailed things like endless genealogies. There are so many books that are out there talking about the 7 days of this or the 7 years of that or this thing and that thing and the mark of the beast and what it is. And just do your due diligence, because a lot of those things are just basically made up. They're basically constructing things that can't be proven one way or another. And that's why I often, when I hear something new and unusual, and it's a new idea to me, I like to spend some time researching it. Is that actually based upon a discovery or something that's factual? Or is that just something somebody's making up to get a following and get clicks on the internet or to sell books or whatever it is? Because there are people in the Christian community who will do those kind of things on a regular basis. And he says, because what happens is they give rise to nothing but speculations, And basically he says people sit there and talk about meaningless things, but never really getting down to the heart of the issue. I remember once being invited to speak at one particular ministry that really did spend a lot of time getting into that kind of stuff. A lot of speculations and ideas and far-fetched themes. And I was talking to the guy who his wife was leading worship for it, and I asked him what it was like, and he simply said, well, it's not a group of people that you could build a church on. He says basically they live for the sensationalism, but they don't really have a commitment to following the word and following God. So Paul says, don't give place to that. Well, I see I'm running out of battery, so I better bring this to an end. But it's been a good week. I hope it's been helpful for you, and look forward to continuing the conversation next week. Blessings.